The late afternoon light filtered through the dusty windows of the county auction barn, spilling golden streaks across the packed dirt floor. The smell of hay, sweat, and aged timber clung to the air, heavy and familiar to every soul in the place. Along the wooden benches, men sat silent beneath the shadow of their hats, boots planted firm, their eyes fixed on the steel gate at the far end. They knew what was about to step through it, and no one was eager for it. The gate swung open, and the bull emerged. Blood Canyon. His coat was a dark, burnished red, his frame thick with muscle, each step deliberate, carrying the quiet menace of a predator. Faint scars traced his hide, reminders of broken fences and men left bruised and broken. His dark eyes scanned the crowd with slow precision, as if he recognized some of the faces and held his own opinion about them. Inside the pen, Garrett Hollister, the only man willing to work this bull, raised his hands slightly in a silent warning, his body taut with controlled caution. On the stand, Amos Ridgely, the auctioneer, hesitated before speaking. Lot number 31. Blood Canyon, he began, his voice missing its usual confident rhythm. Do I hear 1,000? 900? 8? His words echoed off the barn's rafters, but not a single hand moved. Declan Fairborn, leaning against the rail, muttered something under his breath to Thorne Collister, who shook his head without taking his eyes off the bull. They'd all heard the stories, the ranch hands hospitalized, the pastures torn apart, the hours of fruitless pursuit. This was no prize for breeding. This was a liability. Blood Canyon exhaled hard, sending dust curling into the air. His tail swished once, slow and measured. The barn grew so quiet that the faint rattle of the tin roof in the wind seemed louder than it should. Then, from near the back, came the sharp scrape of a chair against the floor. Heads turned in unison. Man stood there, tall, broad-shouldered, his face partly shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. No one in the barn seemed to know him. He didn't glance at Amos Ridgely or at the other bidders. He simply lifted his hand, slow and deliberate, as if the act itself carried no weight. Yet in the charged silence, it felt like a declaration. Garrett. Hollister's eyes narrowed at the stranger. Blood Canyon's massive head turned toward him, nostrils flaring, a low rumble echoing deep in his chest. For a single taut moment, man and beast locked eyes, and the air in the barn seemed colder. Amos Ridgely's voice dropped low, almost reluctant. Sold. No one breathed. No one spoke. And no one would forget the way that hand rose or the strange silence that followed. The moment Amos Ridgely's voice faded, the barn didn't spring back to life as it usually did after a sale. Instead, the silence lingered, heavy as a storm cloud. Garrett Hollister stayed inside the pen with Blood Canyon, his hands steady but his mind racing. Whoever this man was, he had just bought more than a bull. He had bought trouble, the kind that didn't stay behind fences. Blood Canyon's ears twitched toward the stranger, his breathing slow but deep, as if he were memorizing the scent of his new owner. Declan Fairborn pushed himself off the rail and stepped toward Thorne Collister. You know him? He asked. Quietly, Thorne shook his head. Never seen him before. He ain't from around here. Both men kept their voices low, their eyes fixed on the newcomer, who stood as still as if the auction wasn't even happening. There was no smile of triumph, no satisfaction in his expression, only a calm, unreadable face. When Amos Ridgely called for the next lot, the barn's rhythm resumed in fits and starts, but whispers followed the stranger like shadows. Lillian, Crowhurst and Sadie Whitlock, seated near the front, exchanged a glance. Lillian leaned closer, her voice a hushed thread. That's no man looking to turn a profit, she said. Sadie frowned. No, he's got another reason. A few rows back, Ruby Tamsworth tilted her head slightly, studying him as if she might solve the riddle before anyone else. Once the bidding ended for the day, Garrett Hollister led Blood Canyon back toward the holding pens. The bull walked with the same slow, deliberate gait, but his gaze lingered in the direction of the stranger. Garrett had worked with animals long enough to know sometimes they notice things before people did. He kept one hand on the rope lead, the other resting lightly against the bull's neck, but his thoughts were elsewhere. "Why you?" he murmured under his breath, though he knew Blood Canyon wouldn't answer. Outside, the late light was fading, the cold wind cutting through the gaps in the old barn walls. The stranger stepped forward at last, removing his hat with a slow motion, revealing sharp, angular features and eyes that carried the kind of weight only earned by years on hard roads. Amos Ridgely met him halfway, offering a tentative handshake. "Name's Amos. You are?" The man's answer was simple. "Nora Blackwell." Amos called toward the record table. "Write this down. New owner's name, Declan Fairborn." But even as Amos spoke, Declan's gaze stayed fixed past him, toward the holding pen, where Blood Canyon stood like a shadow carved from iron. The wind picked up, rattling the tin roof above them. Somewhere deep inside the barn, Blood Canyon gave a low, rumbling snort. It sounded less like an animal in a pen, and more like a promise waiting to be kept. The road out of the county fairgrounds was lined with bare cottonwoods, their branches rattling like bones in the wind. Declan Fairborn drove in silence, the trailer carrying Blood Canyon swaying slightly behind his pickup. The headlights carved narrow paths through the darkness, illuminating stretches of cracked asphalt and the occasional glint of frost on the grass. In the quiet cab, the hum of the engine was broken only by the faint sound of hooves shifting inside the trailer, a reminder that the dangerous heartbeat of the bull was only a few feet away. At the fairgrounds, Garrett Hollister lingered. After everyone else had gone, he stood near the now empty holding pen, his hat tipped back, staring at the imprint Blood Canyon's hooves had left in the dirt. Something about the stranger's eyes unsettled him. It wasn't arrogance, and it wasn't ignorance. It was the look of a man carrying a burden and a purpose. Garrett had seen that look before on men who came back from places they never wanted to be, and who carried the ghosts of those places with them. Back on the road, Declan's thoughts wandered despite himself. The name Blood Canyon had been in his ears long before today. Years ago, when he'd worked cattle in Wyoming, he'd heard about a bull with the strength to tear through steel fencing and a will that refused to be broken. There had been an incident, the kind no one spoke of plainly, only in whispers around campfires. Declan had never seen the bull in person until today, but he'd heard enough to recognize the scars, the way the animal carried himself, and the eyes. Those eyes were the same as they had been in the story he'd heard, and that alone had made him raise his hand. Meanwhile, in the small diner on the edge of town, Lillian Crowhurst sat with Ruby Tansworth and Sadie Whitlock, nursing, mugs of coffee gone cold. "Mark my words," Lillian said, tapping the rim of her cup for emphasis. "That man didn't just buy a bull. He bought himself a reckoning." Ruby, ever the skeptic, tilted her head. "Or maybe he just likes a challenge." But Sadie shook her head, eyes fixed on the window. No, there was something in the way the bull looked at him, like they'd met before. Declan pulled into the gravel driveway of a weathered ranch house, the wind catching the old porch swing and setting it in a slow, lonely sway. He parked, killed the engine, and stepped out. The cold hit him immediately, but it was the sound from the trailer that froze him in place. A deep, low rumble, not of fear, but of recognition. For a moment, Declan stood there in the darkness, staring at the shape of Blood Canyon in the dim trailer light. Then he spoke, barely above a whisper. "It's been a long time." The cold morning mist clung to the ranch like a shroud, softening the jagged lines of the fences and barns. Declan Fairborn stood by the trailer, steam from his breath mingling with the bulls in the frosty air. Blood Canyon stood still, his massive frame filling the space, his eyes locked on Declan as if weighing him. Declan didn't move right away. He let the moment stretch, feeling the strange pull between them, a silent thread that seemed older than today's purchase dot. As he reached for the latch, a memory surfaced, unbidden. It was a summer years ago, in a different state, a different life. Declan had been working a contract job on a sprawling ranch in Wyoming, hired to help round up a herd that had scattered after a storm. The foreman, a wiry man named Amos Ridgely, yes, the same Amos who'd auctioned the bull yesterday, had warned him about a rogue steer that had been running wild on the property. But what Declan had found wasn't a steer at all. It was a young bull, barely past calfhood, already with a glint in his eyes that told of trouble to come. The encounter had been brief but unforgettable. Declan remembered the way the animal had stood his ground, refusing to flee even when surrounded by riders. It had taken hours to corner him, and even then, the bull had broken free twice, scattering men like leaves in a gale. That day, as the sun bled into the horizon, Declan had watched the young bull vanish into the canyons, the red of his hide blending with the earth. He'd never seen him again, not until yesterday. Inside the house, Nora Blackwell sat at the kitchen table, flipping through old ledgers. She had agreed to rent the property to Declan without asking many questions, but now curiosity tugged at her. She had lived long enough to know when a man carried something heavy in his chest. From the kitchen window, she could see him by the trailer, standing as still as the bull inside. She wondered if he was reconsidering the purchase, or if he was gathering the nerve for something more difficult. Declan finally opened the latch. Blood Canyon stepped out, hooves crunching the frost-hardened ground. The bull's breath came in slow bursts, each one misting the cold air. He didn't bolt or buck. He simply walked past Declan and stopped a few feet away, turning his head to study the man. For a moment, it was as if the years between their two encounters had collapsed into nothing. Declan's hand tightened on the lead rope, his voice low. "You remember me, don't you?" The bull didn't move, but his eyes held the answer. The wind had picked up by mid-morning, sweeping across the open pasture and bending the brittle winter grass in long waves. Declan Fairborn stood near the corral, one gloved hand resting on the rough top rail. Blood Canyon paced inside, his heavy hooves grinding the dirt into dark furrows. There was a restless energy about him, a coil of muscle and willpower that no fence could truly contain. Declan knew this wasn't about training yet. This was about understanding the line between man and beast, and who would step over it. First out from the porch, Nora Blackwell watched in silence, her shawl pulled tight against the wind. She'd seen her share of men trying to prove something with animals, some for pride, others for profit. But this felt different. Declan didn't move like a man looking to dominate. He moved like someone approaching an old wound, knowing it might open again. Down the road, Garrett Hollister arrived on horseback, drawn by equal parts curiosity and concern. "You really think you can handle him?" Garrett called, dismounting. Declan didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed locked on Blood Canyon, who had stopped pacing to stare back at him. "I don't think it's about handling," Declan finally said. "It's about earning." Garrett's brow furrowed, but he said nothing, leaning against the rail to watch. In his years working with rough stock, he'd learned to read the early signs of trouble, and he saw plenty in the way the bull's ears tilted forward and his weight shifted subtly toward the man inside the corral. Declan stepped through the gate, closing it behind him with a slow click of the latch. The distance between him and Blood Canyon felt heavier than any mile he'd ever walked. The bull's breath was steady, his head slightly lowered, his muscles tense but not yet sprung. Declan didn't carry a whip or a stick, only a length of rope coiled loosely in his hand. He moved forward one step at a time, his boots pressing into the soft earth, never taking his eyes off the animal. Then, without warning, Blood Canyon surged forward. It wasn't a full charge, but a sudden, testing rush that sent a cloud of dirt into the air. Declan held his ground, his heart pounding in his ears, resisting every instinct to move. The bull stopped just short, his breath hot in the cold air, nostrils flaring. For a few seconds, they stood locked in a silent standoff, the world beyond the corral falling away. From the rail, Garrett muttered under his breath, "Lord help you, Fairborn." But Declan didn't hear him. He was too busy, looking into the dark eyes before him, where memory and challenge seemed to burn side by side. Blood Canyon took a slow step back, and Declan exhaled, not in relief, but in understanding. This was only the beginning. The morning sun barely warmed the frost-crusted ground, but Blood Canyon was restless. Declan Fairborn had been working the bull in the corral for nearly an hour, moving him in slow circles, keeping his own body language calm but deliberate. The animal's power was obvious in every step, the deep churn of his muscles, the deliberate stamp of his hooves. Declan could feel the rhythm shifting. Blood Canyon wasn't tiring. He was calculating Dot from the edge of the property, Sadie. Whitlock and Ruby Tamsworth had stopped during their walk to watch. "That man's either brave or a fool," Ruby said, clutching her scarf against the wind. Sadie's gaze never left the corral. "Or both," she murmured. Garrett Hollister had joined them earlier, leaning against the fence with his arms folded. He'd seen this pattern before, a bull biding his time, letting the man think he was in control before turning the tables. Declan stepped closer, testing the bull's comfort with his presence. At first, Blood Canyon moved away, keeping a steady distance. Then, without warning, he pivoted sharply and came forward, not in a cautious step, but in a full, surging rush. Declan sidestepped, the ground trembling under the bull's weight. The rope in his hand went taut, but Blood Canyon yanked free, the coils slipping through Declan's gloves and burning his palms. The bull didn't stop at the perimeter. With a violent thrust, Blood Canyon hit the rail, splintering one of the old boards. The crack echoed across the pasture, sending a flock of crows scattering into the sky. Garrett was already moving, shouting for Declan to get clear. The bull struck again, this time breaking the weakened section wide open. The corral, meant to contain him, now offered an open path into the pasture beyond. Declan knew what would happen if Blood Canyon got loose. He'd vanish into the open land, and chasing him would be a dangerous, costly ordeal. He moved instinctively, stepping between the bull and the gap, his hands raised, voice low but firm. "Easy, boy, easy." Blood Canyon slowed, his chest heaving, eyes locked on Declan. For a breathless moment, neither moved. Then the bull snorted, pawed the ground, and backed away just enough for Garrett to swing the gate closed from the outside, blocking the escape. Declan's heartbeat thundered in his ears as the tension broke. He glanced at the shattered rail, then at Blood Canyon, who now stood still, watching him with an expression that seemed almost satisfied. It was clear to everyone there, the bull hadn't just tested the fence. He'd tested Declan, and learned something in the process. The wind had shifted overnight, carrying with it the sharp scent of snow from the high country. By mid-morning, clouds hung low over the ranch, and the air was heavy with the promise of a storm. Declan Fairborn walked the fence line with Garrett Hollister, inspecting the section Blood Canyon had damaged the day before. The fresh boards Garrett had nailed into place still looked fragile compared to the strength of the bull they were meant to contain. Inside the corral, Blood Canyon paced in slow, deliberate arcs, his massive head low, his breath puffing in white clouds. He seemed calmer than yesterday, but Declan knew better. The bull's stillness was never peace. It was patience. Ruby Tamsworth had wandered up the drive with Sadie Whitlock to check on the troublemaker, as she called him, leaning on the fence while Garrett worked. "He's behaving today," Ruby remarked. Sadie shook her head. "That's the kind of quiet that means he's thinking." It happened in less than a heartbeat. A gust of wind slammed the loose gate by the feed shed, and the metallic clang rang across the yard. Blood Canyon's head snapped toward the sound. In a blur of motion, he lunged, striking the fresh boards with a force that split them apart like matchsticks. Garrett shouted, but the bull was already through, his powerful legs carrying him into the open pasture. Declan was over the fence before Garrett could grab him. "Cut him off by the creek," he yelled, sprinting across the field. The ground was uneven, the cold air biting his lungs, but he kept his eyes locked on the bull's dark shape ahead. Blood Canyon wasn't running in blind panic. His movements were purposeful, his path cutting toward the hills beyond the ranch. Declan recognized the direction, the canyons. From the porch, Nora Blackwell watched the scene unfold, her shawl fluttering in the wind. Lillian Crowhurst had joined her moments earlier and now stood silent, her eyes following the chase. "He's not just running away," Lillian said quietly. "He's going somewhere." Nora didn't answer, but the crease between her brows deepened. Declan reached the rise above the creek, just as Blood Canyon splashed through the shallow water below, sending arcs of icy spray into the air. The bull paused for a moment on the far bank, turning his head to look back. That brief glance wasn't fear, it was challenge. And then he was gone, disappearing into the wild country that stretched beyond the property line. Declan stood there, chest heaving, the cold searing his lungs. Behind him, Garrett caught up, shaking his head. "We'll never catch him out there." Declan's eyes stayed fixed on the distant hills. "We will," he said quietly, "because I know where he's headed." The canyons rose from the land like the bones of some ancient beast, their red walls catching the pale winter light. Declan Fairborn rode along the narrow trail on Garrett Hollister's bay gelding, the sound of hooves echoing off the stone. The air was cold and dry, carrying with it the faint metallic tang of the earth. Somewhere ahead, beyond the next bend, he knew Blood Canyon was moving, not in aimless flight, but toward a place he remembered. Garrett rode behind him, his voice low. "This isn't just about catching a bull, is it?" Declan didn't answer right away. His eyes scanned the canyon floor, looking for fresh tracks in the dust. "No," he said finally. "It's about ending something that started a long time ago." Garrett didn't press further, but the weight of Declan's tone settled between them like a shadow dot far below. A narrow stream wound through the rocks, its water flashing silver where the sun reached it. Declan reined in at the sight of deep hoofprints pressed into the damp bank. He swung down from the saddle, crouching to touch the prints with his gloved hand. They were fresh, so fresh that the edges still held their shape. He could almost feel the echo of the bull's weight in the ground. "He's close," Declan murmured. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, Nora Blackwell sat at the kitchen table with Lillian Crowhurst and Sadie Whitlock. A pot of coffee steamed between them, untouched. "I don't understand why he'd risk going after that bull alone," Nora said, her voice tinged with worry. Lillian's expression was unreadable. "Sometimes it's not about the risk. Sometimes it's about what's chasing you, even if it's not behind you anymore." Ruby Tamsworth, arriving late, added quietly, "I think he's trying to settle a debt." Declan and Garrett followed the trail deeper into the canyon, the walls narrowing until the sunlight barely touched the ground. The silence here was thick, broken only by the occasional rustle of loose rock under the horses' hooves. Then, a sound low, resonant, and unmistakable. Blood Canyon's rumbling call echoed off the stone, making it impossible to tell exactly where it came from. The sound wasn't warning, it was invitation. Declan's hand tightened on the reins. "He knows we're here," he said, more to himself than to Garrett. Ahead, the canyon bent sharply out of sight, the air colder in its shadow. Declan nudged the gelding forward, his jaw set. Whatever waited around that bend wasn't just a bull. It was the past, standing in his path, daring him to come closer. The bend in the canyon opened into a wide, shadowed basin, its walls towering high on all sides. The ground here was a mix of hard-packed earth and scattered boulders, the kind of place where sound carried in strange, echoing patterns. Blood Canyon stood near the far wall, his massive frame half in shadow, half bathed in the cold light that filtered down from above. He wasn't moving. He was waiting. Declan Fairborn dismounted, boots crunching on the gravel as he handed Garrett Hollister the reins. Garrett hesitated. "You sure about this?" Declan's eyes stayed fixed on the bull. "I have to be." Every step forward felt heavier, the canyon air pressing in, carrying with it the smell of dust and the faint musk of the animal ahead. Blood Canyon's ears flicked forward, his nostrils flaring at Declan's approach. A memory flashed unbidden. The summer storm years ago, the chaos of the roundup, the moment a young bull had broken through the riders and locked eyes with him before vanishing into the canyons. That bull had been smaller, leaner, but the eyes were the same. Declan realized now that what he'd felt back then wasn't fear. It was recognition, and it had followed him through the years like an unfinished sentence. Blood Canyon pawed the ground once, sending a spray of dirt into the air. The sound echoed sharply in the enclosed space. Declan stopped just inside what he guessed was the bull's comfort line. "It's just you and me now," he said quietly, his voice steady. Garrett watched from the edge of the basin, his muscles tense, ready to move if things turned. The bull shifted his weight, lowering his head slightly. It wasn't a full challenge yet, but it was close. Declan took a slow breath, lowering his hands, keeping his movements deliberate and calm. He could feel the canyon's stillness settle over them, as if even the wind was holding its breath. Blood Canyon took one step forward, the heavy thud reverberating through the ground. Then the bull broke into a sudden, powerful rush, closing the space in seconds. Declan sidestepped at the last instant, the impact of the bull's shoulder brushing past him like a passing freight train. Dust exploded into the air, filling his lungs. He spun, eyes tracking the bull as Blood Canyon wheeled around for another pass. Garrett shouted something, but the sound was lost in the roar of the moment. This wasn't just a fight for control anymore. It was the reckoning they'd both been moving toward for years. The dust still hung in the air, swirling in pale shafts of light that cut down into the canyon basin. Declan Fairborn's boots dug into the earth as Blood Canyon wheeled for another charge, the bull's breath steaming in the cold. Declan knew this was the final moment, the one where either trust would be forged or one of them wouldn't. "Walk away." Garrett Hollister stood at the edge, torn between stepping in and letting it play out. Blood Canyon came forward again, but this time, Declan didn't move aside. He stood his ground, his voice sharp and commanding over the echoing thunder of hooves. "Enough!" The single word cracked through the air like a whip. At the last moment, the bull slowed, his massive head dropping just short of Declan's chest. The ground trembled under the weight of his halted momentum. Declan's hand, steady despite the pounding of his heart, rose to rest lightly against the bull's brow. For a breathless stretch of seconds, neither man nor beast moved. Declan's eyes searched the dark gaze before him, seeing not just the fury and power, but the years of wild survival. He understood now. Blood Canyon hadn't been running from people all these years. He'd been running from the kind of control that sought to break him. Declan knew that feeling well. Slowly, he turned, stepping away without pulling on the lead rope. To Garrett's shock, Blood Canyon followed, his massive hooves crunching softly over the gravel. It wasn't submission. It was a choice. At the mouth of the basin, the bull stopped and looked back into the shadows of the canyon one last time before following Declan out into the open land. By the time they reached the ranch at sunset, the air carried the bite of coming snow. Nora Blackwell, Lillian Crowhurst, Sadie Whitlock, and Ruby Tamsworth stood by the fence, their faces tense with expectation. When they saw the bull walking calmly behind Declan, the tension broke into quiet astonishment. Garrett dismounted, shaking his head. "I've seen a lot in my life," he said, "but I've never seen that." Declan didn't answer. He walked Blood Canyon into the corral, closed the gate, and for a long moment simply stood beside him. The wind rattled the barn roof, carrying with it the distant sound of the canyons. Declan reached up, resting his hand once more on the bull's brow. "We're done running," he said softly. Blood Canyon didn't move, but the stillness between them said enough. The reckoning was over.